This video we're going to be talking about the global winds. So there are three different types of regions that we can see on this earth. One is the equatorial region, the temperate region, and the polar region. Each have their own kinds of weather, and because of the winds, that's what causes the weather within those regions. So first we're going to be starting with the equator. The equator, the wind rises, it condenses at this area at around 10 to 15 kilometers. Around that distance it condenses, and then what happens is that because this is a low pressure area but this is a high pressure area, what happens is the wind moves towards the high pressure area so it can fill out the empty space. Then what happens is it reaches an area where it's relatively high, or this Tropic of Cancer line, and at that point, because it's already high pressure and this is low pressure, it satisfies that need, and since it's already warm, since it's colder than this area where it started, it sinks back down because it's colder, and then creates a convection current. Same thing can be found in the southern hemisphere. It rises due to evaporation, goes to a high pressure area, sinks because it's colder, and then completes the convection current. Next we have the polar winds. The polar winds moved also towards the low pressure area in the equator. They move towards this low pressure area until they reach this low pressure area over here. This area is known as a jet stream area because the high pressure over here in the polar regions are trying to catch up with the low pressure that's moving very fast over here. Hence, it's going to be very fast. So flights typically try to be in this low pressure area over here. All right, the air comes here. Then what happens is that because this is generally warmer than here, it causes the air to rise because warm air rises and here cold air cold air sinks. And then it goes back over there to fill in that empty space, and then we have another convection current. Same thing can be found over here. Now we're going to be talking about this temperate region. The temperate region is very different because what's happening is that this wind over here is going to be pulling this air down, but the wind here is going to be pulling this up. Then they meet together using this convection current, and we implement the same thing in the northern hemisphere. We can see that the winds in the temperate region are going in a clockwise motion, while the winds in this area are going in a clockwise motion, but the winds in this equatorial and polar region are going in a counterclockwise motion. And that kind of sets the winds that are going to go through the earth, and that's what sets this temperate zone apart from these zones over here. But first, let's get into these zones first. We're first going to be starting in the polar region. The wind is moving down, but because of the Coriolis effect, it tilts to the right. Or in other words, it starts from the east in this polar region, but eventually tilts to the west. This is what we refer to as polar easterlies. The same thing can be found over here. It starts in the east, but then moves over here to the west. Same thing can also be said with the equator. It's coming from the east and going to the west. However, we don't call them polar easterlies, mainly because what's happening is they're not in the polar region, and people have actually named it a different thing. They call them trade winds, and the reason why is because the winds in the northern hemisphere help bring ships from Europe to South America, but the winds from the southern hemisphere help bring ships from Africa to North America. Because of this trade, the Europeans and people who traded along this area called it trade winds. And lastly, we have this temperate region over here. The temperate region is much more different because it's moving in a clockwise motion. Because it's moving in a clockwise motion, unlike these winds over here that are moving in a counterclockwise motion, what's happening is that you see this wind that's pulling this thing up? Well, that's actually what's happening over here. It's going to be pulling it up. So the wind is going to end up traveling like this. And for the southern hemisphere, it's going to go kind of the opposite. It's going to travel like this. We call these winds westerlies because they originate from the west and then move east. So wherever the wind originates from, or whatever people mostly call it, that's what the name of the wind is. Trade winds because they were mainly used for trade. Polar easterlies because they come from the poles and they mainly come from the east. And then westerlies because they come from the west and travel to the east. So the Coriolis effect mainly plays a humongous role because we can see in the poles, the wind is going like this. So here, the wind that we see over here originating, it's going straight, but the Coriolis effect tilts it. The Coriolis effect is tilting it even though it's going straight down. And for the poles, what's happening is we have this wind and this wind over here. This wind is going straight, this wind is going down, but the Coriolis effect tilts it. And same thing over here with this temperate zone. This wind is going like straight, but the Coriolis effect is tilting it, and also can be seen over here. So it's really the Coriolis effect as well as the convection currents that are happening inside of the atmosphere that is mainly making up of the wind patterns of our Earth. We mainly see this kind of pattern happening throughout the Earth because of these kinds of conditions. And they actually help shape a major role in meteorology as well as being able to understand Earth science. Now we're going to be moving on to what each convection current is named. The meteorologists refer to these as cells, and these cells, they named it as the Hadley cell. And the reason why we named it Hadley is because of George Hadley, who observed this. Then we have the Ferrel cell, and then we have the polar cell. The polar cell is named because it mainly is in this polar region over here. So those are the names of the different cells or the different convection currents happening throughout our Earth. And the same thing can also be said in the southern hemisphere also. Now the thing is, in this low pressure area or the Tropic of Cancer or the exact equator or the high pressure, what's happening is these areas are relatively calm. Because they're relatively calm, ships would typically get stuck there because the winds wouldn't be able to move the ships. And back in the day, because they weren't able to do it, they also named it some special names. We're going to look at this equator over here. They named the equator the intertropical convergence zone. Because there's no movement and these areas are relatively calm, because the winds, they typically don't go past the equator. So if you're stuck over here, the sailors would generally not want to travel through the different types of, through this lines over here. So they named this one the intertropical convergence zone. They named this one at the Tropic of Cancer over here. They named it horse latitudes. The reason why they named it horse latitudes is because the English, they would typically carry their horses to other parts of the world. But what happens is that typically when the English reached this zone, and that's mainly where they were trading, mainly in the northern hemisphere with the Americas, when they discovered the New World, what happened was a lot of ships got like stuck here because it was relatively calm and there was zero wind. They had to dump their horses so they were able to have enough space and would be able to lose weight so that they would be able to go away from this area, relatively calm area, and be able to go back with the wind. Hence they named it horse latitude because they had to dump the horses. And lastly, they named this one over here, they named it the polar front. And it's kind of self-explanatory because it's mainly in the polar region. Also keep in mind that this area in the air, it moves really fast because the high pressure is trying to catch up with this low pressure area. So it's called the jet stream region. So these are all about global winds. There are polar easterlies, westerlies, and trade winds. And we have the polar cell, the Ferrel cell, and the Hadley cell. And the winds that are generated typically move either clockwise or counterclockwise based on their region, and because of these convection currents, it's what determines these winds over here. And also the Coriolis effect helps play a major role in wind movement also.